Okay, I tried to record a dozen times how to greet you all. I have absolutely no clue. Welcome, and today we are talking about shading. To be more specific, we will talk about different techniques to create hard and soft edges, and then apply these techniques on a sphere and a cube. And after that, I'll explain to you how ambient occlusion works. And then I'll show you how you can make your shadows less lifeless. And last but not least, we will scratch the topic of non-opaque objects. So let's start with the first technique. I used a hard brush and then a soft eraser to create a soft edge and a hard edge. That's one of the possibilities. Then you can do exactly the opposite using a soft brush and a hard eraser to create the exact same effect. Another rather popular technique is to use the selection tool and select an area and then fill it out with a soft brush. Now I show you a technique that I like to use almost all the time is to either smudge or use a blurring tool in between two colors. Normally you can change the properties of a blurring tool also between hard and soft edge. The hard edge creates more texture and the soft edge is, as you can guess, pretty much soft. There's not much of a texture going on there. As you can see, here's an example. Now let's fill a sphere and a cube with these techniques. If you have a complex form, like for example a skull, a flower, or whatever, it is most helpful to use a reference to figure out where there's a soft edge or a hard edge. Naturally, the more complex something is, the longer it takes. As you can see, I'm using the clipping mask to lay down the shadows on a new layer. And for the sphere, I used a soft brush and a soft eraser. And for the cube, I used the selection tool to fill out the shading. And as you can see, for the cube, I used two different shades, since on one side the shade will be stronger than on the other. Now also I added a shade on the ground from the sphere and the cube. For the sphere, I used a soft brush, and I tried to figure out where the shading would end with drawing a line. There are ways to exactly like calculate or draw out where exactly the shade would go along, but we won't discuss that today. But if it's requested, we could discuss this. I can show you how to draw the shades exactly appropriate to their form. Write this in the comments if you want to see anything of that sort. The shades that are thrown to the ground also change from hard to soft, depending on how far away it is from the object. The further away, the softer and brighter it gets, which is why the edge for the sphere is soft throughout and the one for the cube is harder the closer it gets to the object. Now let's talk about ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is the light and surroundings that reflect onto an object. Depending on the material, it will reflect more or less. It also depends on how close or far away the objects are from each other and how they reflect on them then. To create the correct color that is reflected, I pick the color that I want to reflect, then the color of the shadow and mix them. That's one way to do it. For not guessing what color you might have to use to do it. Another way is also to just use the color you want to reflect on the object and then decrease the opacity on, so you do that on another layer and then you can decrease the opacity of that layer. This is what I'm showing here with the gray example. Here's an example of what you could create if you take your time and the references, of course, and apply exactly those techniques and this knowledge to a drawing. Now, let me show you a more specific example by adding colors into it here, making the cube red and the sphere then blue. And I show you how the ambient occlusion acts differently depending on how close the objects are to each other. As you can see, the blue sphere would throw a bluish tint into the shadow of the cube, and vice versa, the reddish cube would throw a reddish tint into the blue sphere's shadow, but only in the shadow. Like it's not really going into the light part of the object. Now let's talk about how you can bring more life into your paintings, or more specifically in your shadows, just by using one simple trick. That is something that a lot of artists do wrong, is to use black on a new layer to create the shadow or something in a grayscale, and then lower the opacity and just multiply it. I would suggest that you go down the color wheel and use a darker shade instead of black, and then you can multiply that if you want to, or just use that one color directly. But making your shadows like warm or cold would help a lot to make your shading a bit more, bring more life to it, and it looks aesthetically also more pleasing than using black. Of course, those colors also reflect into the shadow that's thrown onto the ground by the objects. That way, those objects are more incorporated into the environment. Now, let's scratch the topic of shading non-opaque materials like skin and water. I also would love to create a more in-depth tutorial about non-opaque materials, but I need some more time for that. Anyways, let's talk about skin at first. As you can see, the soft edge of the shadow is rather glowy in a reddish tone, but that is only the case when the sun or other strong light hits the skin. And then for the ambient occlusion part, I take the color that reflects onto the shade of the skin and mix it in like I showed earlier in the ambient occlusion part. Now let's talk about the water drop. As you can see, I activated the cube again, and later on I will also add a blue background because it's easier to see the droplet that way. What I like to do is to make the rim, the outer rim of the water droplet white, and then I add the colors from its surroundings into the droplet, but always on the opposite inner walls from where the things are. So, for example, the cube is on the right side, so I'll add the reddish color on the left side of the droplet. If there would be something blue on the left side, it would show or reflect on the right side of the droplet. And then I add a few highlights on top of the outer wall of the droplet where the light is shining on. And otherwise, the background is just shining quite clearly through in the middle of the droplet. And that's how it looks, like it's transparent. And on the shadow that's thrown onto the ground, I do basically almost the same thing, just that the outer rim isn't white. Now I have to end this video somehow. I hope it was nice for you. I hope it helped. And next upcoming tutorial will be hair. So I hope you're looking forward to this as well. And see you next time.